Alright, well, our next episode is considered by many to be the greatest episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. It's called The Best of Both Worlds, and I'm going to review Part 1. It's a two-part episode, but Part 1, which was the cliffhanger that ended the third season. It originally aired on June 18th, 1990. It was written by Michael Piller and directed by Cliff Bull. So let's get on to the plot with this very first part of The Best of Both Worlds. Now, the Enterprise is investigating the destruction of one of the most distant colonies in the Federation. And since the obliteration looks suspiciously like the work of the Borg, and the reason why they're able to tell that was because the Enterprise encountered some similar descriptions back in the episode Q Who when they first encountered the Borg. And, as you may or may not remember, at the end of the first season, in the neutral zone, we saw some destruction that also had some similar displays. So, having had that insight, Commander Shelby joins the Enterprise. And for the past 6 months, Commander Shelby has headed the Borg Tactical Analysis Team at Starfleet Headquarters, and she confirms that the Borg attacked the colony. Now, shortly after, the Enterprise encounters the Borg, and they order Picard to transport himself over to their ship. Now, Picard refuses, and in the short battle that follows, the Enterprise manages to escape. Picard then takes the Enterprise to a sensor-obscuring nebula, and the Borg position themselves outside the nebula, waiting for the Enterprise to reappear. Now, during this period, the crew devises a new weapon to use against the Borg. They will channel a high-energy beam through the navigational deflector, tuned to the Borg's most vulnerable frequency. Now, the Borg begins sending random charges through the nebula, and as the charges start hitting the Enterprise, Picard takes the ship out of the nebula. Now, after a short chase, the Borg lock onto the Enterprise with a tractor beam, and several Borg appear on the bridge and kidnap Picard, after which the Borg set course for Earth. Now, Riker gives chase and sends an away team to the Borg ship, hoping to slow them down. And just as the away team completes its mission, they discover the Borg have transformed Picard into a Borg. Now, when a rescue fails, the away team returns, and meanwhile, Riker powers up the new weapon and tells Worf to prepare to fire. Now, the Borg ship hails the Enterprise, and guess who's hailing them? None other than Picard, who is now speaking for the Borg. He introduces himself as Locutus, and he tells them that the existence they've known is over, and he concludes, "From this time forward, you will service us." Riker responds by saying, "Mr. Worf, fire." And that is the conclusion of Part 1 of The Best of Both Worlds, and the end of the third season. So this episode, as I said, is considered by many to be the favorite of Star Trek The Next Generation, and it actually won Emmy Awards for Outstanding Art Direction for a Series and Outstanding Sound Editing for a Series. And it also appeared in TV Guide's 100 Most Memorable Moments in TV History. That came out in July 1st, 1996, and it ranked number 50 there. And the episode was ranked number 70 on the 100 Greatest TV Episodes of All Time. So a lot of good recognition for this episode, both by critics and by the fans. Now, the first thing I'd have to say about this one is this was written completely by Michael Piller. At this point, a lot of the writing staff had a lot of turmoil throughout the third season, and if they had known, in hindsight, that the third season was kind of going to be a renaissance period for Star Trek The Next Generation, really beginning with yesterday's Enterprise, they probably would not have left the show, but they were having lots of conflicts with both Michael Piller and Rick Berman, and Michael Piller at one point actually wrote a memo and sent it to everybody, basically giving them a writing 101 line and telling people that the story should have a beginning, middle, and ending. And that really insulted a lot of the writing staff. They felt like if he had some problem with talking to the writers about, how things how things should be done, that it should be done in person rather than just a note being sent to everybody. So they were really offended by that, and it's hard to write for Star Trek. Let's be honest about that. A lot of the writers have mentioned that, and there's a lot of conflict. So a lot of those writers had left at that point, leaving Michael Piller to be the one to write this episode. And Michael Piller himself was actually thinking that this was going to be his one and only season, and that he was going to be heading out the door at the end of this time. So he felt like, I'll do this one last episode, it'll make a really good one, and I'm going to tackle this. So that was what he assigned himself to do. And actually, originally in an early draft, it was considered that Data and Picard were going to be taken and combined as a Borg, but somebody said, why should we do that? And they didn't really have a good answer, so that idea was dropped, and they just went with Picard for that. So Michael Piller decides to write this episode, and you can really tell by the way he writes that a lot of the decision-making that he was going through, deciding whether he was going to stay or leave the show, was translated into the Commander Riker character. Now, originally it wasn't thought of that this was going to be a Riker episode, but it really turned out that way, because aside from the Borg resurfacing again, Riker is trying to decide if he's going to stay on the Enterprise or not. He's been offered another chance to become captain this time of the USS Melbourne, and he has a lot of tension between himself and Commander Shelby, because Commander Shelby is a new young hotshot who plans to convince Captain Picard that she's the person for the job to take over for Commander Riker. But when she realizes that Commander Riker hasn't made up his mind yet, that causes a lot of tension between the two of them. Commander Shelby is somebody who is ambitious and likes to take risks, and Commander Riker sees that as a threat. And the part that really bothers Riker is the fact that he used to be that way, and he feels like he lost something. And there's a really good scene where he's in 10 Forward talking with Troy, and he's wondering, what is he still doing there? Picard has just given him kind of a kick in the rear end, saying that, you don't need to work under a net, you're ready to take command, and the Enterprise will be just fine without you. And Riker is wondering what's holding him back from doing that. Because in the first 2 seasons, we've set up the idea that Riker really took the Enterprise D job because he saw it as a stepping stone to getting his own command. But as the years went by, it turns out he's becoming comfortable on the Enterprise, and Troy even calls him a little more older and a little more seasoned, and Riker doesn't like that comment too much. But what she means by that is that he's really growing accustomed to being on the Enterprise and interacting with the people there. And I think the point with that is, ambition is great, but if you're enjoying where you're at, and you're happy and you have your own rewards interacting with those people, that can be a great thing too. And that's what Michael Piller was trying to wrestle with, and what Riker is too. Do I stay, or do I go? Do I see this as just a stepping stone of what I want to do? Michael Piller saw himself as directing features and other TV shows as well. Or do I like where I'm at, and do I want to continue in that role? So that's something Riker is really wrestling with in part 1 here. And as I said, the tension between Riker and Shelby is great too. Now, another thing that I should address too is a lot of fans were a little bit nervous at the end of this episode. Not only because the Borg were set up to attack Earth, but they realized since Picard was abducted and transformed into a Borg, what did that mean for the future of the show? Because this was still the 3rd season, so it was early enough where we might have wondered, well, is the Picard character being written out of the show? Is he going to permanently be a part of the Borg? And then Riker takes over as captain? Is that a possibility? Another thought that might have gone through some people's minds with Riker trying to figure out whether he was going to stay on. Is Riker going to leave the show? And is Shelby going to take over as first officer? Some people were worried about that, and a lot of people weren't too pleased of the idea of Riker leaving and Shelby taking his place. So all of those things were legitimate questions at the time, because the series was still rather young. So we didn't know if this was going to be a big shift and change that was going to take place. So those were all questions at the end of part 1. And that's really the end of the 3rd season. This show in particular was a lot easier to go through, just as far as creating the Borg and the set, because they had learned all of that from season 2 on Q Who, and they kind of ironed out all the problems there, so that was a lot easier to do on this one. And it was kind of funny, actually. I read in an article that Patrick Stewart, when he was dressed in the Locutus outfit, when he walks up to the screen, he looks really menacing and intimidating. And he walks up there and he says, "I am Locutus of Borg. Would you consider buying a Pontiac?" And that cracked up the entire cast and crew, and it was just a light moment, and it showed really a shift in Patrick Stewart as well, too, because the first season especially, Patrick Stewart was, he came from a Shakespearean theatrical background where you took your work very seriously. And at one point he actually called a meeting with the first season cast and said, I think we're doing a little too much fooling around. And Denise Crosby, who played Tasha Yar, said, "Oh, come on, Patrick, we gotta have a little fun, too." And Patrick Stewart said, "We're not here to have fun." And that really changed, and this really shows in this season at the end that Patrick has kind of come around from that view, and he realizes you can still take your work seriously and have a good time in the process. So that's important to see, and kind of refreshing too. And from that point on, I think Patrick Stewart really started growing with the other characters and thinking of them as his second family. So, now that we've come to the end of Season 3, it's time to reflect back on these episodes. And my first question to you is, what are your thoughts on Season 3? I personally feel like Season 3 was a huge step up for Star Trek The Next Generation. You see just an increase in the quality of writing in Season 3. You really see the cast blending together well. And even though behind the scenes, as I said, there was still conflict between the writers, they turned out some outstanding episodes this season. And I think it really shows when you watch these. Another question I have for you, and I've asked this in previous seasons, are what would you say is your favorite episode from the season? And what is your least favorite? It's hard for me to say for those. I'm always somebody who likes to appreciate a whole bunch of episodes in a show. I really did like the Best of Both Worlds. Yesterday's Enterprise, I would say, is another top one up there. But there are a lot of them to pick from this season, I have to be honest. So maybe a better question with this too is, what do you think is probably the best underrated episode of this season that really doesn't get a lot of credit? I would say, I don't know. I'd have to think about that one a little bit. Maybe I'll comment myself below when I come up with an answer, but you comment below too. What do you think is your favorite one and is the most underrated one too as well? So I'm curious what you think about that one too. And come up, if you do have a least favorite, come up with that one too. I don't know if I have any that I really disliked in this season, but there are some that are more B episodes and probably are a little more forgettable than the others too. So I do have to acknowledge that. Other than that, feel free to subscribe to both of my YouTube channels that have Star Trek reviews. Season 1 and 2 of Star Trek The Next Generation, at least at the time of this recording, is still on my Bob the Business Builder channel. And Season 3 and moving forward will be on Bob's Galaxy Class Reviews. Thanks for watching, guys, and stay tuned for another season.